In a small Philadelphia courtroom, 69-year-old Jacob Miller faces charges for stealing a loaf of cinnamon raisin bread, his late wife Elizabeth's favorite. A broken man, once the heart of Miller's family bakery, Jacob lost everything after Elizabeth's death in the pandemic. The courtroom sees only a petty thief until Major Thomas Brooks, a military officer, reveals Jacob's past, feeding hungry soldiers for free during tough times. As hidden stories of his kindness unravel, the case transforms. Who was this forgotten hero, and why did he steal? The truth will leave you speechless. Discover untold stories of quiet heroes like Jacob. Subscribe to our channel to celebrate decency and justice. Your support keeps these narratives alive. Join us to honor kindness and uncover hidden truths, because every story deserves to be remembered. Subscribe now. In a small, dimly lit courtroom in suburban Philadelphia, the air was thick with routine indifference. The worn wooden benches creaked under the weight of a sparse audience, mostly law students scribbling notes for their practical education. Jacob Miller, a 69-year-old man with a snow-white beard and tattered clothes, stood before the judge, his bandaged hand trembling slightly. The charge was petty theft, a single loaf of bread swiped from a local market. The prosecutor, a man whose voice carried the chill of bureaucracy, recited the accusation with mechanical precision. Jacob Andrew Miller, repeat offender, caught stealing a loaf of bread. His words hung in the air, devoid of empathy, as if Jacob's life could be reduced to a case file. Jacob didn't deny the charge. His head bowed, his voice barely audible in the room's poor acoustics. He murmured, "I just needed something to eat for the evening." The words were soft, almost swallowed by the hum of fluorescent lights casting stark shadows across his weathered face. A ripple of laughter passed through the courtroom, sharp and mocking. One of the law students in the back row leaned toward his peer, smirking. "If he's so hungry, why not just ask for food? Stealing's a choice." The comment stung, though Jacob gave no sign he heard it. His eyes, clouded with exhaustion and something deeper, grief perhaps, remained fixed on the floor. He stood alone, a frail figure dwarfed by the weight of the room's judgment. His court-appointed attorney, a young man with an overloaded caseload and a distracted air, barely glanced up from his phone. "Your Honor, my client pleads guilty. Can we expedite this?" His tone was flat, tinged with boredom, as if Jacob's fate was just another checkbox on a long list of minor cases. He hadn't bothered to ask Jacob a single question before the hearing, hadn't dug into the why behind the theft. To him, Jacob was a statistic, a repeat offender whose story wasn't worth the time. A spectator in the gallery whispered to their companion, "I've seen him sleeping behind the market for weeks now. Always near that old bakery." The words floated, unnoticed by most, but they carried a fragment of truth about Jacob's life, a life no one in the room seemed interested in understanding. The arresting officer stood tall, his chest puffed with confidence. "Caught him red-handed, Your Honor. No room for dispute." His voice was firm, his certainty unshakable. To him, Jacob was a simple problem with a simpler solution. Arrest, charge, repeat. The judge, peering over his glasses, adjusted his posture. "Mr. Miller, this is your third petty theft charge this year. Do you understand the potential consequences?" Jacob nodded faintly, the motion almost imperceptible. His hands, rough and trembling, clutched the edge of the defendant's table. The law students scribbled furiously, debating sentencing guidelines in hushed tones. To them, Jacob was a case study, a living example of recidivism, nothing more. They didn't notice the way his eyes flicked toward the courtroom clock, as if he knew exactly when the nearby bakeries would toss out their day-old bread, or the faint tremor in his fingers that betrayed more than just age. The judge cleared his throat, ready to proceed. "Very well. Let the record show the defendant's name as Jacob Andrew Miller, former resident of..." His words were cut off by a sharp, decisive click. The courtroom door swung open and every head turned. A middle-aged man strode in, his military dress uniform crisp and immaculate, his posture rigid with purpose. His face was solemn, etched with a quiet intensity that seemed to shift the room's atmosphere. The law student stopped writing. The prosecutor's cold demeanor faltered. Even the judge paused, his gavel hovering. Who was this man, and what could he possibly know about an old man caught stealing bread? The room, once buzzing with apathy, now crackled with curiosity. Jacob's eyes lifted for the first time, meeting the officer's gaze, and something unspoken passed between them. A flicker of recognition, of history. 30 years earlier, Jacob Miller had been a different man. He and his wife Elizabeth had poured their hearts into Miller's Family Bakery, a modest shop on Maple Street where the scent of fresh baked bread drew crowds every morning. Their sourdough was the stuff of local legend, their cinnamon rolls a county-wide obsession. For 3 decades, they'd worked side by side, their laughter mingling with the clatter of mixing bowls and the hum of ovens. The bakery was more than a business. It was their life, their love made tangible in every loaf. When young recruits from the nearby military base came home on leave, Miller's was their haven. Jacob and Elizabeth welcomed them with open arms, charging half price or nothing at all for soldiers. "My son's in the service too," Jacob would say with a warm smile, though he never elaborated. Some wondered if it was true, but no one pressed him. His kindness was enough. Then came the diagnosis: stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Elizabeth, the heart of the bakery, was given 6 months. She fought, but the disease was relentless. When she passed, something in Jacob shattered. The man who had risen at 4 a.m. for 30 years to knead dough, who had greeted every customer with a grin, couldn't find the strength to carry on. The bakery limped along for another year, but the pandemic delivered the final blow. With no savings and debts piling high, Jacob lost everything. The bank foreclosed, and new owners took over the shop that had been his life. At 67, he found himself homeless, wandering the streets near the bakery that still held Elizabeth's memory. He slept in alleys, survived on scraps, too proud to beg, too broken to rebuild. No one in the courtroom knew the weight of his loss, the way Elizabeth's absence haunted every step he took. They didn't know that Jacob only stole one kind of bread, cinnamon raisin, Elizabeth's favorite. Each loaf he took was a quiet act of remembrance, a way to hold on to her just a little longer. Locals had seen him lingering near the market, accepting hot water from the coffee shop with a nod of thanks, but refusing handouts. In his backpack, the arresting officer had found a faded piece of paper, a relic of a life long gone, though its contents remained a mystery to the court. As the military officer stood in the doorway, his presence a silent promise of answers, the room waited to learn what connected him to Jacob and what truth he carried about the man who stole bread to survive. In the dim light of the faded photograph, Jacob Miller stood tall, his chest puffed with quiet pride, surrounded by a cluster of young soldiers whose grins stretched wide despite the biting chill of a 1991 winter. The oven behind him glowed faintly, a beacon of warmth in a world of frost and scarcity. On the back of the photo, in ink now bleeding into the paper's creases, a simple note: "To Mr. Miller, the only warm bread in cold times." That image, tucked away in some forgotten drawer, held a story no one in the courtroom knew, or cared to know. Military records, buried under decades of dust, mentioned a local baker who, during that brutal winter deployment, had fed stationed troops at his own expense when supply lines crumbled. Commendation papers had been drafted, the name Jacob A. Miller scrawled proudly across them, but they were never awarded. The officer who'd pushed for the honor was reassigned. The papers shuffled into oblivion. Jacob's act of selflessness, like so much of his life, slipped through the cracks of memory. Now, in the sterile fluorescence of the courtroom, none of this mattered. The air was thick with judgment, the kind that settles before a single word is spoken. Jacob sat hunched at the defendant's table, his hands trembling not from guilt, but from the weight of years of loss, of hunger, of being unseen. To the spectators, he was just another vagrant, a thief who'd rather steal than earn. Their whispers carried the sting of assumption. Why doesn't he get a job? Lazy, probably. The prosecutor, sharp in his press suit, saw only a repeat offender, another box to check in his endless stack of cases. His voice dripped with certainty as he laid out the charge. Jacob Miller caught red-handed stealing a loaf of bread from a corner store. The judge, weary behind his wire-rimmed glasses, saw a straightforward case, unfortunate but clear. The law was the law. Justice, cold and mechanical, demanded its due. No one saw the man Jacob had been. No one pictured the baker who'd risen before dawn. kneading dough with hands that knew the rhythm of care, feeding an entire town through winters that gnawed at the soul. No one imagined the husband who'd once danced with his wife in their tiny kitchen, her laughter filling the gaps where money fell short, or the widower who'd lost his anchor when she passed, his purpose unraveling like a frayed thread. No one saw the man who'd given freely to strangers, young soldiers far from home, their faces gaunt with hunger and homesickness. To the courtroom, Jacob was invisible, reduced to a single act, the theft of bread. Jacob's heart, though, carried the weight of those unseen years. Each day since his wife's death felt like wading through molasses, every step heavier than the last. The bakery, once his pride, had shuttered years ago, its oven cold, its shelves bare. Grief had carved hollows in him, and poverty had filled them with despair. Stealing the bread hadn't been a choice born of malice, but of survival, a fleeting, desperate act by a man who'd once given so much. As the prosecutor's words sliced through the room, Jacob kept his eyes on the table, tracing the wood's grain with a calloused finger. Shame burned in his chest, not for the theft, but for the man he'd become, so far from the one who'd once stood proudly before his oven. The spectators leaned forward, expecting the predictable, a fine, maybe a few days in jail. The law students in the back, half paying attention, scribbled notes or smirked, their youth shielding them from the gravity of the moment. The court-appointed attorney, distracted by his phone, barely glanced at Jacob, his defense a rote mumble of procedure. To them, this was just another case, another old man who'd slipped through society's cracks. But then the courtroom's rhythm broke. A man strode through the double doors, his presence commanding the room before he uttered a word. His uniform was crisp, every crease a testament to discipline, his posture ramrod straight as if he'd just stepped off a parade ground. Major Thomas Brooks, United States Army Logistics Corps, introduced himself with a voice that carried the weight of authority and memory. The judge blinked, protocol momentarily forgotten. The prosecutor shot to his feet, his objection sharp but unsteady. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor." The judge, curiosity flickering in his tired eyes, waved him off. "Major Brooks, you may proceed." Brooks stepped forward, his boots clicking against the floor, and stood at parade rest. His gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on Jacob, who still hadn't looked up. When Brooks spoke, his voice filled the space effortlessly, honed by years of commanding attention. "This man is not a criminal," he began, each word deliberate. "He's the person who fed dozens of soldiers, including me when we had nothing." The courtroom stilled. The law student's pens froze. The prosecutor's half-formed objection withered. Even the spectators, so quick to judge, shifted uncomfortably, their assumptions cracking. Brooks reached into his uniform pocket and produced a worn, folded paper, its edges softened a tonish. He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. "This is a letter I wrote in '92 as Private First Class Thomas Brooks," he said. "It states, and I quote, 'Mr. Miller saved our morale more than once.'" He turned to face the room, his eyes locking onto the faces before him, demanding they listen. "In '91, my unit was stationed near this town. A logistics error left our supply chains in shambles. For 8 days, our rations were barely enough to keep us standing. We were hungry, cold, and our spirits were breaking." Brooks's voice softened, but its power didn't waver. He looked at Jacob, who sat motionless, his head still bowed. Every morning at dawn, this man, Jacob Miller, would pull up to our gate in his delivery van. He brought fresh bread, pastries, sometimes hot soup, even thermoses of coffee, all of it at his own expense. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of disbelief and shame. "He never asked for a dime. When my commanding officer tried to arrange payment, Jacob refused. 'Consider it my service,' Nahon said." Brooks removed his cap, clutching it against his chest, a gesture raw with respect. His voice trembled, just for a moment, as memory pulled him back to that winter. "I was 19, homesick, scared. Jacob's kindness was the only warmth I felt for months. His bread wasn't just food, it was hope. It was a reminder that someone out there cared." He gestured toward the courtroom doors where 3 more veterans had entered, their faces etched with the same gratitude. "I wasn't alone. We all remember Jacob Miller." In that moment, Brooks felt the weight of that winter get them in, the ache of hunger, the sting of frost, the gnawing fear that home was too far to ever feel real again. But he also felt the warmth of Jacob's bread in his hands, the way it steadied him, gave him something to hold on to. He'd been just a boy then, but Jacob had seen him, had seen all of them, not as soldiers but as kids who needed care. That kindness had anchored Brooks, shaped the man he'd become. Standing there in his immaculate uniform, he felt a debt he could never repay. But he'd be damned if he let Jacob face this alone. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted. The law students, who'd been so flippant, now sat in chastened silence, their eyes fixed on their notebooks. The spectators, who'd whispered their judgments, looked away, grappling with the sting of their own haste. The court-appointed attorney, jolted from his apathy, stood abruptly, his voice unsteady but firm. Your Honor, in light of this new information, I request a complete case review and move to dismiss all charges. The prosecutor, his confidence shaken, nodded. Boys, the state has no objection, Your Honor. The judge removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose, as if trying to reconcile the man before him with the one described. We've been sitting in judgment of a man who once fed this entire town without asking anything in return, he said, his voice heavy with realization. He looked at Jacob, who finally raised his head, his eyes meeting Brooks's for the first time. The old man's face was lined with years of sorrow, but there was something else there now, a flicker of recognition, of connection. You were just a boy then, Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper, rough with emotion. In Brooks's face, he saw the ghost of that young private, all wide eyes and chapped hands, clutching a loaf of bread like it was a lifeline. Jacob's heart twisted, not with pride but with a quiet ache. He'd never sought thanks, never wanted medals or praise. He'd given because it was right, because those boys had needed him. Now, seeing Brooks stand for him, Jacob felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. Not the kind that fills the belly, but the kind that mends the soul. In the quiet of the courtroom, a man in a flour-dusted apron rose, his hands shaking not from fear, but from the weight of sudden clarity. Your Honor, he said, his voice catching like dough on a rough edge. I'm the current owner of what was once Miller's Bakery. I bought it from the bank after it was foreclosed. The judge, her face stern yet attentive, nodded slowly, sensing the shift in the room. The bread Mr. Miller took, the baker went on, his words trembling with emotion. It was baked from his own recipe, the one we still use because our customers won't have anything else. His voice broke, not from weakness, but from the dawning realization of his own oversight. I want to drop any charges from my side, and I want to apologize. He stepped forward, his boots scuffing softly on the polished floor, and reached out to Jacob, who stood at the defendant's table, his worn coat hanging loose on his thin frame. Sir, the baker said, his eyes glistening, your recipes still feed this town. Your traditions, they're the heart of it. I didn't know who you were. Jacob's face, carved with the lines of hunger and time, softened, his tired eyes meeting the baker's with a flicker of recognition, not of the man, but of the sincerity in his words. From the back, a slow clap began. It came from the veterans, their weathered faces etched with memories of Jacob's kindness. The sound wasn't a triumphant cheer, but a solemn acknowledgement of a man forgotten for too long. The applause spread, a quiet tide washing over the courtroom, each clap a small act of atonement. Jacob's shoulders, bowed by years of unseen burdens, lifted slightly. For a moment, the proud baker he'd been, a man who kneaded dough with steady hands and greeted every customer with warmth, shone through the cracks of his weathered exterior. The judge's gavel fell with a soft thud. Case dismissed, she said, her voice steady but laced with something softer. Leaning forward, she added quietly, and may we all be forgiven for forgetting those who've served us. Her words lingered, a quiet prayer for a town that had let a good man slip away. Outside, the courthouse steps became a gathering place, an impromptu reunion sparked by a story that spread like wildfire. Veterans arrived throughout the day, each carrying a piece of Jacob's past. One spoke of birthday cakes Jacob baked for soldiers far from home, their icing swirled with care, a taste of comfort in lonely barracks. Another, her voice thick with gratitude, told of how Jacob delivered a care package to her pregnant wife when her leave was canceled, his quiet kindness a lifeline. A third recalled the blizzard of '94, when snow buried the town and power failed. Jacob kept his wood-burning fireplace roaring, baking loaf after loaf for those in emergency shelters. Each story wove a tapestry of a man who served not with a uniform, but with flour-dusted hands and an open heart. Local news cameras captured it all, their lenses shifting from a small story, a homeless man caught stealing bread, to a forgotten hero finally seen. Jacob, hesitant at first, was introduced to the Veteran Support Center. "I wasn't a soldier," he protested softly, his voice rough from disuse. "I was just a baker." Major Brooks, a broad-shouldered man with a gentle demeanor, smiled. "You served in your own way, sir," he said firmly. "Now let us serve you." Those words broke through Jacob's resistance, like sunlight through a long-closed curtain. He nodded, and within weeks, he moved into Cedar Grove, a residence for seniors who had left a mark on their community. For the first time in years, Jacob had a bed, meals without hunger sting, and doctors to ease his arthritic hands. The baker who now owned Jacob's old shop approached him one morning, his apron dusted with the day's work. "I'd like to rename the bakery," he said earnestly, "Jacob's Oven, where kindness never expires. And I'd like you to teach me your techniques, if you're willing." Jacob's hands, trembling with age and pain, hesitated. "My hands aren't what they used to be," he murmured, staring at his gnarled knuckles. The baker shook his head. "Your knowledge, Jacob, it's irreplaceable." Twice a week, Jacob visited his old bakery. A special chair was set near the ovens, its worn cushion a throne for the master baker. He sat there, his voice steady as he guided the young baker through his craft. Culinary students flocked to learn, their notebooks filled with tips on dough and rising. The cinnamon raisin bread, Elizabeth's favorite, named for the wife whose memory Jacob carried like a quiet flame, became the bakery's signature. Its warm, spiced aroma filled the shop, and a portion of every sale went to the homeless shelter, a nod to the streets Jacob had walked. On the bakery's wall hung a photograph framed in simple wood. It showed Jacob in the courtroom, standing tall beside Major Brooks, who held the loaf that sparked it all. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Feeding a community is service. Remembering that service is justice." Jacob never spoke of his time on the streets, never blamed those who passed him by. When asked how he endured with dignity intact, he'd say, "Elizabeth would have expected nothing less." His voice soft but resolute, her memory both anchor and compass. 6 months later, the town gathered for a ceremony. The mayor, her voice warm with pride, presented Jacob with a community service award, its edges gleaming in the afternoon light. The military-based commander read a commendation drafted decades ago, but never delivered, its words heavy with gratitude for a man who served quietly. As Jacob rose to accept it, the room rose with him, not out of duty, but out of deep respect. "I don't know what to say," Jacob began, his voice stronger, nourished by meals and purpose. From the crowd, Major Brooks, now a friend, called out, his voice warm with camaraderie. The room buzzed with anticipation, a crowd of eager faces leaning forward, their eyes fixed on Jacob. "Just tell us how to make that sourdough properly, sir," someone called out, their voice light but earnest. A wave of laughter rolled through the gathering, warm and unforced, like a shared secret among friends. Jacob's weathered face softened, and for the first time in what felt like years, a genuine smile spread across his lips, crinkling the corners of his eyes. It was a smile that carried the weight of memory, of hard-won lessons, and of a quiet pride that had long been buried under the grind of life. "That," he said, his voice steady but tinged with a playful glint, "is a lesson that'll take more than a single day to learn." His words hung in the air, not just a promise of bread, but a reminder of the patience and care that went into crafting something truly meaningful. In the wake of Elizabeth's passing, the town came together to honor her legacy in a way that felt as grounded and nurturing as the woman herself had been. They created a small scholarship fund in her name, designed to support culinary students who didn't just excel in the kitchen, but who poured their hearts into serving their community. Elizabeth had been the kind of person who fed not just bodies, but spirits, and the fund was meant to carry that spirit forward. When the committee turned to Jacob to choose the recipients, he felt the weight of the responsibility settle over him like a familiar coat. He thought of Elizabeth's quiet strength, her way of giving without fanfare, and he knew exactly what to look for. Find the quiet ones, he told the committee, his voice low but firm, each word chosen with care. The ones who give without being asked, who don't need a spotlight to do what's right. They're the ones who will feed people's souls, not just their stomachs. His words weren't just instructions. They were a reflection of the life he and Elizabeth had shared, a life built on small, steady acts of kindness that rippled outward in ways they could never have predicted. Jacob's mind often wandered back to the days when he and Elizabeth had run their small bakery, their hands dusted with flour, their hearts full despite the lean times. They had fed an entire generation, not just with bread, but with the warmth of a place where people felt seen, where a loaf was more than sustenance. It was a gesture of care. Yet, as the years wore on, life had a way of turning the tables. Jacob remembered the sting of those final days, when he found himself standing in lines he never thought he'd join, asking for scraps of what he had once given so freely. The memory burned, not because of the hunger, but because of the indifference he'd sometimes faced. The way people averted their eyes as if his need made him less human. Now, as he stood before the crowd teaching them the art of sourdough, he felt something shift inside him. The bread had come full circle, returned to him not just as food, but as a symbol of respect, long overdue. The townspeople's eager faces, their laughter, their questions, they were a quiet acknowledgement of all he had given, all he had lost, and all he still had to offer. The town itself seemed to carry a new undercurrent, a subtle change that went beyond the scholarship or the bread. The courthouse, with its stern columns and polished floors, stood as it always had, a monument to order and law. The judge still presided, his gavel falling with the same measured rhythm. But something had shifted in the air, in the way the judge and the townspeople looked at those who came before them. People worn down by desperation, their eyes hollow with hunger or fear. Where once there might have been only judgment, now there was a flicker of memory, a recognition that justice wasn't just about laws or punishment, it was about remembering the quiet heroes, the ones like Elizabeth and Jacob, whose small acts of service had stitched the community together during its darkest days. Sometimes, Jacob thought, justice wasn't found in a courtroom at all. Sometimes it was as simple as a loaf of bread, offered with an open hand and a heart that refused to forget. For Jacob, the act of teaching the crowd wasn't just about passing on a recipe, it was about reclaiming a piece of himself, about honoring Elizabeth's memory by sharing the lessons they had learned together. As he spoke, his hands moving through the familiar motions of kneading dough, he felt her presence beside him. Not as a ghost, but as a warmth, a quiet strength that steadied him. He thought of the countless loaves they had baked, the countless lives they had touched, and he realized that their story wasn't over. It lived on in the scholarship, in the students who would carry their legacy forward, in the townspeople who now saw him not as a man who had fallen, but as one who had risen again. And as the crowd leaned in, hanging on his every word, Jacob felt a quiet certainty settle over him. Kindness, when given freely, never truly fades. It lingers, like the scent of fresh bread, waiting to be shared again.